Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to D News Plus today. I'm Trace, and this is our best episode ever, obviously, because it's about propaganda. You see what I did there? We're going to talk a lot about propaganda over the next few episodes in this series. There are 3. Make sure you subscribe so you get all those episodes. Check us out on SoundCloud and iTunes if you want to get just one episode of all of this squished together. But over this series, we're going to talk about when we started using propaganda and what it's used for and what exactly it is, 'cause that's actually pretty hard to define. We're also going to talk about whether it works or not and a whole bunch of other stuff. So let's kick into it. First, propaganda is not a new idea. It's a common misconception that it came from the beginning of the 20th century, but the concept of propaganda dates back way before World War I and World War II. I mean, many consider Alexander the Great's face on currency in the 3rd century BCE as a form of propaganda. You know, they were spreading his face around and being like, check out this guy. He's pretty great. He's on money. That's pretty old, 3rd century BCE. In fact, one of the earliest examples of total propaganda, like that's why it was created, was in 151 BCE with the Boston inscription. I may have pronounced that wrong. B-E-H-I, stun. Anyway, it's about Darius I's ascent to the Persian throne. So it's like, Darius is the best. Many early civilizations weren't able to produce any form of propaganda, because if you think about it, you need a way to create something and then spread that information around. Even some of the earliest forms of propaganda weren't necessarily considered, like free speech. For example, the citizen class of Greeks in Athens, they didn't have outlets for free speech. They didn't have newspapers, they didn't have podcasts, they didn't have TVs and radios. But they were much more aware of issues that were facing their city-states, and they realized that the opinions on those issues were varied and that public opinion could be swayed. So they used games and theater and open courts and religious festivals, and that would help sway public opinion. Playwrights would deliberately write shows about politics and social and moral issues to get opinions out into the populace. Even handwritten books were making the rounds, and this is of course before the Gutenberg press. That wasn't for centuries and centuries. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Pope Urban II used religious propaganda to help gain support for the Crusades. In the early 1500s, Martin Luther used the newly invented printing press to make some of the first forms of propaganda, at least, from a modern definition, talking about all sorts of religiously based beliefs that he had that were different from the church at the time. He sold hundreds of thousands of pamphlets to support the Reformation of the church, many containing cartoons of the donkey pope of Rome. Woof. Not too long after that, during the days of the Spanish Armada, this is around later 1588, the Spaniards wrote stories about their great victories at sea against England and spread them around France and Italy and were like, what up, we're the best. But they were stories. They weren't actually true, at all. The truth was, the Spanish Armada had devastating losses. So think about that for a second. If that sounds familiar, it's because it should. That's what propaganda is for. It's supposed to tell you something and spread an opinion, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a true opinion. The Japanese and other countries used this tactic to keep the will of their citizens from crumbling during long wars, saying, we're doing great out there, everybody. Just keep on fighting and we'll get there. The term propaganda isn't negative in itself. It really is just to inform or spread information to the public. It originally came from Sacra Congregatio de Propaganda Fide, or Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. It was a Vatican organization created in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV. As is normal in religion, its goal was to spread the faith and get that information out to the people so that they could hear the word of the Lord and come into the church and spend some money. The word propaganda actually comes from the word propagate, and it comes from Old Latin, because it's D News Plus, so etymology time! So propag, which is something set out, and to fasten. You got propagation, which includes spreading of plants. If you were to take a cutting from a plant and create another plant, you're propagating the plant. The Catholic Church also educated their missionaries, and they would call that propagating the faith as well, as we just mentioned. Then in 1929, in World War I, they had a definition that was material or information propagated to advance a cause, etc. And that's where we think of it today, is the propagation of information. You're taking this information and specifically advancing your cause. And eventually that became a negative in the United States because we saw other countries as doing it to combat us, especially during World War I and World War II, I mentioned earlier the Japanese, they were getting propaganda saying, keep fighting the war, we're winning, we're winning. And of course, the Nazis in Germany in World War II, they had a lot of propaganda, but it wasn't always just our enemies. The USA was also getting propagandized constantly, all the time, and we still do. Once the Catholic Church created this institution with the goal of spreading information and spreading the faith, propaganda was then used in instances throughout history. Benjamin Franklin and Paul Revere created pieces of art that were made into pamphlets and papers and distributed throughout the colonies to help inspire public support to fight for freedom. Things like the snake cut up into pieces with the caption, "Join or Die," that you probably recognize some of that as "Don't Tread on Me" these days. Each snake representing a different colony. There's Paul Revere's depiction of the Boston Massacre, and that was just 5 years before the start of the Revolutionary War. Not too long after that, we saw the French Revolution, where there were tons and tons of different types of propaganda coming out of there. Voltaire and Rousseau were writing these anti-Bourbon sentiments, and the Bourbon family had reigning kings from 1589 to 1792. The French moderate Republican Party distributed broadsheets among enemy troops, offering rewards for people who were deserting. In fact, the more you look into the history of propaganda, the more that you see it used to have reputable and dignified associations, spreading ideas and information about a cause to try and gain support. And usually, history has judged them as just causes. But that did change around World War I, which I hinted at earlier. The advent of technology made propaganda easy to make and easy to distribute. And once that happened, propaganda could reach this mass audience. You could propagandize everyone. It wasn't just a leaflet that someone had created in order to tell you something important. It could be a leaflet created by anybody to tell anybody anything, and it spread like wildfire. But unfortunately, governments quickly began to censor, and propaganda developed this bad rap because only certain people were allowed to propagandize, and those people were not always the people you'd want to be able to do that. Governments began touting huge victories and belittling defeats and making light of things that maybe were more important and making a mountain out of a molehill that maybe shouldn't have been. All of this is to win over the hearts and minds of people, or at least keeping them cheerful and confident and united and discrediting the enemy at the same time. And this wasn't just happening in dictatorships. Many democratic nations that had free press worked with their governments toward national efforts. The Germans were the first to realize it wasn't just your own country and your enemies' countries that you wanted to propagandize, but neutral countries too. Because a lot of what we've talked about so far is me propagandizing you or my government propagandizing me. But what happens if my government starts propagandizing the enemy or somebody else? So the Germans set up powerful radio stations that were so powerful that they could broadcast to Mexico and South America. And over those radio waves, they would say that they were a favorable country and that the Allies were not so great. And they were trying to cause uprisings in these colonial possessions of the Allies. Because if you remember, prior to World War II, there were still empires from the West. So when Germany would say, hey, countries over in South America and Central America, throw off your imperial oppressors. You don't need those people. That's what we're trying to do. And that would make the Allies not look so great, closer to, at least to the United States and the homeland there. And that's how it continued throughout the 20th century. I mean, we're still being propagandized now. Obviously, a big time for propaganda that we glossed over was World War II, but a lot of people talk about that. Rosie the Riveter and war bonds and, the depictions of Jews by the Nazis. And it seems like propaganda can be associated with periods of stress and turmoil, but does that work? Does propaganda actually influence your hearts and minds? Find out about that tomorrow. Let us know a memorable piece of propaganda from your history. What kind of propaganda stands out to you now looking back? For me, it's the Bugs Bunny cartoons from World War II, where they were depicting Japanese people as stupid and really bad caricatures. And it was Bugs Bunny. That's so weird. Let us know yours down in the comments. Make sure you subscribe so you get more of D News Plus. And if you want to learn some other really awesome stuff, check out the Great Courses Plus. We want to thank them for sponsoring this episode of D News Plus. The Great Courses Plus gives you on-demand access to a huge library of really awesome video courses presented by experts in their fields. So you could watch Experiencing the Hubble, Understanding the Greatest Images of the Universe. It's really awesome. I highly recommend it. If you want unlimited access to all of the Great Courses Plus's lectures, help us out. You can sign up for a free month today. All you have to do is go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/dnewsplus. Link is down in the description. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow.